China just broke the world's solar efficiency record again, and silicon's 70-year reign is officially over. LONGi's new perovskite cell hit 34.6% efficiency, certified by America's own National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Silicon has a hard physical ceiling, around 29%, a wall the industry has spent 70 years failing to cross. You heard that right. China just walked 5.5 points past a barrier. Physics itself called impossible, and the cell that did it can be printed like newspaper. To understand why this changes everything, you need to understand the wall silicon hit first. The 70-year wall. You've seen them your entire life, even if you never really stopped to look. The black rectangles on your neighbor's roof, the endless rows of panels lining highways and farmland, the arrays glinting on satellites in orbit hundreds of miles above your head. Every single one of them runs on the same fundamental technology. A team of engineers at Bell Labs cobbled together back in 1954. Silicon. For over 70 years, it has been the undisputed king of solar power on this planet, and almost nothing has come close to challenging it. Until now. But here's what almost no one outside the solar industry actually knows. Silicon doesn't have an engineering problem. It has a physics problem. And there's no amount of money, no amount of research, no amount of human ingenuity on Earth that can solve it. You see, every silicon solar cell ever built can only absorb a narrow slice of the sunlight hitting it. The rest of that energy bounces off the surface, slips straight through the cell, or burns away as waste heat. That isn't a flaw in the design. That is the design. The atomic structure of silicon itself physically cannot capture any more sunlight than that, no matter how perfectly the cell is built or how much you pay for it. That ceiling sits at roughly 29% efficiency. Scientists call it the Shockley-Queisser limit. You can call it the wall. For 7 straight decades, the smartest minds on the planet have thrown billions of dollars and entire careers at climbing it. Every breakthrough you've ever read about, every record-shattering silicon panel announcement from the last 40 years has gained ground in tiny fractions of a percent at a time. The best silicon panel money can buy today sits just 1 or 2 points below that ceiling. There is nowhere left to climb. And that's the part the entire global solar industry has been quietly terrified of for years. The next breakthrough cannot come from making silicon better because silicon cannot get meaningfully better. The next breakthrough has to come from replacing silicon entirely, or watching the entire industry slowly die. There is no third option. That replacement just arrived, and it didn't come from Berkeley, or Berlin, or Tokyo. The cascade begins. It came from China, and it didn't arrive as a single, clean breakthrough. It arrived as an avalanche, record after record after record, each one landing before the world had even finished processing the last. It started in Nanjing. A research team there broke the 30% efficiency threshold for perovskite cells. Take a second to let that number settle in. 30%, the exact wall silicon cannot cross. A perovskite cell just stepped straight over it like the wall wasn't there. And here's what makes that even more devastating. Perovskite isn't some exotic material from a science fiction lab. It's a class of crystal structure named after a Russian mineralogist back in the 1830s, made from cheap, abundant ingredients you can dissolve in liquid and paint onto a surface. The technology that just humiliated silicon is roughly as fancy as printing ink on paper, and it's already outperforming a 70-year-old, multi-trillion-dollar industry. Then came the University of Science and Technology of China, holding the previous world record for single-junction perovskite cells at 26.7%, already stunning for a technology most Western scientists were still treating as a curiosity. Then April 2026 happened, and everything changed. A privately developed Chinese perovskite cell hit 27.98% efficiency in laboratory testing. On its own, that number sounds incremental. But here's what almost nobody outside the industry caught about it. It was the first time in history any single-junction solar technology of any kind had outperformed every single-junction silicon cell ever measured. You heard that right. Every single one. That was the symbolic moment silicon lost its crown. Not in a press release, not in a marketing campaign. In a Chinese laboratory, with American certification, against 7 decades of accumulated silicon engineering, and the silicon lost. And that's when you start to notice the pattern. These records weren't being broken once a decade. They weren't being broken once a year. They were falling every few months, sometimes every few weeks, and almost every certificate that came out had a Chinese institution stamped on it. Nanjing, Hefei, Shanghai, Shenzhen. Different teams, different labs, different companies, but the same flag, the same speed, the same playbook. The rest of the world wasn't even close. Western research labs were still publishing optimistic projections about what perovskite might be capable of someday. Chinese labs were already certifying what perovskite had done last quarter. But here's the thing about a cascade. It doesn't stop. And the records you've heard so far? Those were just the warm-up. Because waiting at the top of the leaderboard is one Chinese company that has turned record-breaking into a quarterly habit, and the number it just put on the scoreboard is so far past silicon's ceiling, it shouldn't physically be possible. The LONGi earthquake. That company is LONGi. And if you've never heard of them, you should start paying attention right now, because LONGi has done something to the global solar industry that no Western company has managed in 70 years of trying. They've made silicon's ceiling look like a speed bump. It began in June of 2025. LONGi engineers built a large-area crystalline silicon perovskite tandem cell, meaning they layered perovskite directly on top of silicon, letting the two materials capture different slices of sunlight that neither one could grab alone. The result hit 33% efficiency, a new world record. And here's the detail that should have set off alarm bells in every Western capital. That record wasn't certified in Beijing. It wasn't certified in Shanghai. It was certified by the United States National Renewable Energy Laboratory, America's own gold standard testing facility, the same lab the entire Western solar industry trusts to validate its own claims. Nobody could dismiss it. Nobody could call it Chinese exaggeration. It was American certified, ironclad, and it broke the world record in front of everyone. But LONGi wasn't done. Just months later, they shattered their own record again, this time with a flexible perovskite-silicon tandem cell that hit 33.35%, also certified by NREL. And pause for a second on that word flexible. The previous record was on a rigid panel. This one bent. It could wrap around a curved surface, line the body of a vehicle, fold into places no silicon panel on Earth could ever go. And it was still breaking world records while doing it. And then came the number that broke the industry's spine, 34.6%. That is LONGi's current world record for a two-terminal perovskite tandem device. Stop and feel that figure for a second. Silicon's theoretical maximum, the wall that 70 years of human engineering could not cross, sits at 29%. LONGi just put up 34.6. That isn't an improvement. That isn't a breakthrough. That is 5.5 full percentage points past a barrier physics itself was supposed to enforce. You heard that right. 5.5 points past the line nobody was ever supposed to cross. To put that in perspective for you, the entire global silicon industry, with all its trillions of dollars and 7 decades of relentless engineering, has been fighting tooth and nail to gain 1 percentage point at a time. LONGi just walked past the finish line by more than 5. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone running a Western solar company right now. LONGi isn't a research lab. It isn't a university experiment. It is a manufacturer. The same company breaking world records in physics is also one of the largest solar panel producers on the planet, meaning the gap between lab record and factory floor is shorter for them than for anyone else alive. But efficiency records alone don't kill an industry. Lots of technologies have broken laboratory records and quietly died on the way to market. So why is this one different? Why is perovskite the one that finally takes silicon down for good? Because the efficiency numbers are only half the story. The other half is somehow even more devastating. The other half of the story. Here's what nobody talks about when they show you a silicon solar panel. The thing is brutally expensive to make. And not because the materials are rare. Silicon is literally one of the most abundant elements in the Earth's crust, sitting in every grain of sand on every beach you've ever walked on. The expense comes from what you have to do to that silicon to turn it into a working solar cell. You have to purify it to almost obsessive levels. You have to melt it in furnaces running at over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. You have to grow it into massive crystal ingots over the course of days. You have to slice those ingots into wafers thinner than a human hair without shattering them. And then you have to do dozens more high-temperature, high-precision steps before you have something that can sit on a roof and turn sunlight into electricity. The whole process devours so much energy that a brand new silicon panel has to operate for 1 to 3 full years just to generate back the electricity it took to manufacture it in the first place. Now, here's what perovskite does differently. You dissolve it in liquid. You coat it onto a surface glass, plastic, metal, whatever you want. You let it dry. That's it. You heard that right. The technology that just humiliated silicon in laboratory testing is manufactured using the same fundamental process as printing a newspaper or laminating a food wrapper. No 2,000-degree furnaces, no crystal growing chambers, no diamond-edged wafer saws, just coating and printing fast, cheap, and at room temperature. The economic implications of that single difference are catastrophic for the silicon industry. Perovskite isn't just a better performing solar cell. It's a fundamentally cheaper one to produce. At speeds and scales, silicon manufacturing physically cannot match, no matter how many factories you build or how much you optimize the supply chain. But the cost advantage isn't even the most disruptive part. Silicon panels are rigid, they're heavy, they shatter under flex. That means every silicon panel you've ever seen has to be bolted to a flat, sturdy surface, a roof, a steel frame in a desert, a satellite chassis. There are entire trillion-dollar markets where silicon physically cannot go. Perovskite goes everywhere. It can wrap around the curved body of an electric vehicle, turning the car itself into a generator while it sits in your driveway. It can coat the windows of a skyscraper and feed the building's grid all day long. It can line the wings of a drone, the fuselage of an aircraft, the surface of a satellite, where every single ounce of weight costs thousands of dollars to launch into orbit. It can be sewn into clothing. It can be rolled out across surfaces silicon would crack in half trying to cover. Perovskite isn't the next generation of solar power. It is a different category of solar power, entirely one that opens up markets silicon was never even invited to. But none of this matters if you can't make it at scale. And that's where almost every silicon killer technology in history has quietly died somewhere between the laboratory and the factory floor. So the only question left is whether anyone on Earth has actually figured out how to manufacture this stuff at industrial scale yet. The answer is yes, and it's exactly who you'd expect. The factory that shouldn't exist yet. The company is called GCL Perovskite, and what it is doing right now, in 2026, was supposed to be at least a decade away. Here's the dirty secret of the clean energy industry. Most revolutionary technologies you've ever read about die in a very specific place, the gap between a laboratory record and a working factory. Scientists publish a stunning result, headlines explode, investors get excited, and then 5 years later the technology quietly disappears because nobody could figure out how to build it at the scale needed to actually matter. The graveyard of promising solar technologies is enormous, and almost every tombstone says the same thing: couldn't scale. That's the gap GCL Perovskite just leapt across. GCL is operating the world's first gigawatt-scale perovskite manufacturing facility. And that word gigawatt gets thrown around so casually in energy headlines that most people don't actually feel what it means. So let's make it real. 1 gigawatt of solar capacity is enough to power roughly 200,000 average American homes. You heard that right. A single one of these factories, running at full capacity, can produce enough perovskite cells every year to put solar power on the rooftops of every home in a city the size of Salt Lake City or Richmond, Virginia. That isn't a pilot line. That isn't a demonstration project. That is industrial scale, factory floor, full-tilt manufacturing, and GCL is the only company on the planet running it for perovskite. And it gets worse for the rest of the world. GCL isn't producing tiny experimental cells the size of a postage stamp. They're targeting 27% efficiency at full mass production dimensions 1.2 meters by 2.4 meters. In imperial terms, that's roughly 4 feet by 8 feet. The size of an actual rooftop solar panel. The exact size that homeowners and contractors install on real buildings every single day. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. Because here's the brutal truth about laboratory perovskite records. They're almost always set on tiny cells, sometimes smaller than a postage stamp. Scaling that performance up to a full-sized panel without losing efficiency is one of the hardest problems in materials science. It is the exact step that has buried previous solar technologies. GCL just skipped past it. So while research labs in Germany, Japan, and the United States are still publishing optimistic press releases about pilot lines that might someday produce perovskite at meaningful scale, China already has a factory shipping full-sized panels right now. And the gap between "we might be able to make this someday" and "we are making this today" is the gap between competing in the future and being left out of it entirely. But hold on, none of this means perovskite has actually won yet. Because no matter how impressive the efficiency records are, no matter how cheap the manufacturing is, no matter how many panels GCL ships out the factory door this year, there is a problem with perovskite that critics have been hammering on for years. A problem so serious that a lot of Western scientists still don't believe perovskite will ever truly replace silicon. And honestly, they're not entirely wrong. The problem nobody wants to talk about. You deserve the honest version of this story, so here it is. Perovskite has problems, real ones, the kind that have killed every previous silicon killer technology that came before it. And if you only watched the cheerleading version of this story, you'd walk away thinking silicon is already dead. It isn't, at least not yet, and the reasons why are worth understanding. The first problem is the one that has haunted perovskite research from the very beginning: durability. The silicon panel currently bolted to a roof somewhere in Arizona or Germany or Australia is built to last. The industry standard warranty runs 25 to 30 years. That panel will sit through scorching summers, freezing winters, hailstorms, dust storms, and decades of relentless ultraviolet bombardment from the sun, and at the end of all of it, it will still be producing roughly 80% of the electricity it generated on day one. That is an extraordinary engineering achievement, and it is the reason silicon became the global standard. Now, here's the perovskite reality. The best perovskite cells on the planet today demonstrate operational lifespans measured in months, not decades, months. The most optimistic estimates push that out to maybe a year or two under real-world conditions. That is not a small gap. That is the difference between a technology you can finance with a 30-year mortgage and a technology you'd be embarrassed to sell to a homeowner. The reason for that fragility is built into the material itself. Perovskite crystals are sensitive to moisture, sensitive to heat, sensitive to oxygen, and sensitive to the very ultraviolet light they're supposed to be absorbing. The same delicate molecular structure that makes them so good at capturing sunlight also makes them prone to breaking down under it. It's like building a race car out of paper incredibly fast, until the first time it rains. Then there's the second problem, and this one is even uglier. Lead. Almost every high-efficiency perovskite cell in the world today contains lead in its chemistry. Lead is what makes the crystal structure work so beautifully. It's also one of the most notorious environmental toxins humanity has ever dealt with, a heavy metal that poisons soil, contaminates water supplies, and accumulates in the human body for a lifetime. Now imagine deploying that across millions of rooftops worldwide, and then imagine what happens decades later when those panels weather, crack, and eventually get discarded. That is not a hypothetical concern. That is an environmental catastrophe waiting in slow motion. And then there's the third problem, the chasm. It's the gap between a record-breaking laboratory cell, pristine, perfectly assembled, tested under ideal conditions, and a panel that has to survive a decade of hailstones. Summer heat warping its frame, winter freezes cracking its seals, and birds doing what birds do all over its surface. That gap is the graveyard. Every previous silicon killer technology you've ever heard of, from organic photovoltaics to dye-sensitized cells, got swallowed by it. These aren't minor caveats. These are the exact reasons most Western scientists have spent the last decade quietly betting that silicon would still be the king in 2050. But here's what those scientists didn't see coming. China was already solving every single one of these problems simultaneously, and the answers were already moving through peer review, while the West was still busy listing the objections. China's 3 answers. Start with the lead toxicity problem. In October of 2025, researchers at Fudan University in Shanghai published a paper in Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals on Earth. The paper described a lead-free perovskite cell achieving 17.7% efficiency. On its own, that number isn't a record breaker. But that isn't the point. The point is what it proves. The chemistry works without lead. Every environmental objection critics have been raising for a decade has a viable workaround already moving through peer-reviewed publication. Nail 1 pulled out. Now the durability problem. A team at the East China University of Science and Technology developed what they call a graphene polymer armor. Here's why it matters. When perovskite absorbs light, the material physically expands by about 1%, then contracts again when the light fades. That cycle, repeated millions of times, mechanically tears the cell apart from the inside. It's the single biggest reason perovskite fails so quickly. The graphene polymer armor cuts that expansion from 1% down to 0.08%. You heard that right. A more than 10-fold reduction in the exact stress aging these cells to death. Nail 2 pulled out. And the third problem, the lab-to-rooftop chasm, can only be solved by deploying panels in the real world and collecting data over years. That is exactly what China is doing right now. Every panel GCL ships generates real-world durability data. No Western lab can replicate without first building the same scale of manufacturing China already has. Nail 3 quietly removed while no one was watching. 3 problems, 3 answers. All Chinese. All simultaneous, and not one of them by accident. The electrostate endgame. Because what you've been watching isn't really a solar story. Step back and look at the full picture. China already manufactures roughly 70% of the world's silicon solar panels, meaning the technology perovskite is now poised to replace is itself a Chinese-dominated industry. China controls the rare earth supply chains that feed nearly every clean energy technology on the planet, from wind turbines to electric vehicle motors. China dominates global battery manufacturing, including the lithium iron phosphate chemistry quietly taking over electric vehicles worldwide. And now, on top of all of that, China holds every meaningful world record in the technology that will replace silicon entirely. This isn't a country catching up. This isn't a country competing. This is a country lapping the field in the legacy technology, simultaneously winning the laboratory race for the replacement, and simultaneously building the only factories on Earth capable of mass producing it. You heard that right. Every single layer of the global energy transition, past, present, and future, runs through Chinese factories. That's what an electrostate looks like. A country whose geopolitical leverage runs through the wires, the panels, and the batteries of the global energy transition, the same way the United States once leveraged the dollar and oil. So when LONGi posted 34.6% on the scoreboard, it wasn't just another efficiency record. It was the moment the rooftops of the future got their nationality. Because whatever comes after silicon, and something is coming, the records have already proven that will be designed in China, manufactured in China, and shipped to every rooftop from Toronto to Sydney, from Berlin to Tokyo, by a country that perfected it while the rest of the world was still arguing about whether perovskite could survive a winter. The wall didn't fall. China walked through it.